Well, hello there everyone! So, I recently got the ability to record 3DS games thanks to modifying it and also getting the access to the Arctic Base program, so hey, why not cover one of my favorite handheld game series, in this case, Etrian Odyssey. Etrian Odyssey 5 is the last numbered entry in the series, but it's one of the easiest starting points, at least narrative-wise, due to how standalone it is, even more so than the other games, as it has a big gimmick of being the most unique 3D Atlas game, because there's not a single enemy or boss from the previous Etrian Odyssey games returning, and in this one, it's all original. Though, maybe unsurprisingly, Etrian Odyssey 5 also has the smallest boss roster in the series at only 11 major boss fights, half of which are post-game. Though, for the sake of because I want to, I'm going to be including 2 mini-bosses that feel significant enough to count as boss fights, and that also give you additional party members in their battles, because, I don't know. And while not my favorite boss selection in the series, I do think Etrian Odyssey 5's bosses are very much quality over quantity, as I don't think there's a single bad boss in this game. Would I have liked a major rival boss, or any optional boss fight you could take on before the endgame? Sure, of course, but it does make for a tighter boss roster, even if I prefer the boss rosters of Millennium Girl and Nexus overall. But let's get on with our ranking. At number worst, who's honestly still decent. Number 13, Lamia. To be honest, Lamia isn't at the bottom because she sucks. She's perfectly fine, but she's at the bottom because she's kind of boring. Her main gimmick is swarming the field with her snakes, and you'd think with her having the second largest health bar in the game, she'd put up some serious threat, but no, not really. Her boss fight is kind of a death by 1,000 cuts, but she stopped at only 2 cuts. There's not really any story or interest to Lamia either. She's just kind of a scary monster attacking people in the 4th stratum with no personal connection to the character the questline focuses on. Speaking of that character, Marina is honestly the least interesting character in the game. She's just an elf with big bazongas. Even as a teammate, she's kinda underwhelming, as she's a Celestian necromancer. At that point, why not just bring back Lily? You already had her as a party member that filled that exact role. This was, I don't know, this was more work to make a character that served no real purpose. Lamia works mechanically fine, but she doesn't really fit the Crystal Cave dungeon, and honestly, she's not that interesting as a boss. Her big, scary ultimate attack inflicts full bind on the party, but, well, it doesn't damage or kill anyone, so there's nothing stopping me from casting Hygea's Bowl, rendering her ultimate attack completely worthless. And for some reason, she's supposed to be the second to last boss you're intended to fight in the game, but honestly, she's by far the easiest of the super bosses and isn't even close. That 50,000 HP doesn't mean much when Agar can hit her for 24,000 with a single charged up attack. Again, not a terrible boss, and if this is the bottom of the barrel, it's not a bad barrel, but it's honestly the one that if you were to tell me, hey, name off all the Etrian Odyssey 5 bosses, this is the one I'd forget. Number 12, the Coffin Demon. Coffin Demon is less of a boss and more of an oh shit major encounter where Solor will join the party in battle, and it's the first required fight in the game with a 6th teammate, which I think is pretty darn cool. I like that a lot. Now, despite his crazy appearance, Coffin Demon really just opts to beat the crap out of you while the Horned Skulls are there to provide support. It's not a super crazy fight, but it doesn't need to be, as it's one of the last fights before we reach the climax of the game's first half, and honestly, considering that this boss fight pops up right out of nowhere, I'm kinda glad that it's not too difficult, otherwise that would have been very annoying. Number 11, Harvester. Harvester is kinda weird. It's pretty cool having a secret boss that you have a unique way of running into, but waiting for her to spawn in on the floor is kind of a pain in the butt, and the fight isn't much better, as she's the only boss in the game that gets to act twice every turn without any sort of conditions in place, so she's always going to act, and then she'll buff herself. Even if you get the preemptive on her, she'll buff herself. She'll also start inflicting you with debuffs, and focus primarily on inflicting you with binds, because when a party member is bound, it not only locks out their moves, but makes them vulnerable to her signature move, Marionette, where she'll start manipulating the bound party members' actions to attack for her. Not a bad idea in theory, but kind of falls flat in execution, because status effect bosses are generally frustrating, though Etrian Odyssey is usually better about that. This one is unfortunately no exception to the general rule of being kind of a pain in the butt. And she also has something that I really hate, where if you remove her buffs, either with a counter buff or with a nullifying option, she'll start throwing a temper tantrum and hitting your team for absurd damage, likely one-shotting them even with an in-game build. This fight struggles to strike a good balance because you're either going to get bogged down at every step, or you're going to effortlessly stomp her in 3 turns, because you're either in post-game or you're using Wraith Nukes because she doesn't have enough health to survive it. Still, I do think the gimmick is creative, and it's a unique discovery of this hidden boss that puts it above Lamia and Coffin Demon, but when the fight's like essentially doing a Trap Tricks player in Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, yeah, that's not exactly what I'd call fun. Number 10, Owlbear. Now, for our early game boss, the Owlbear is potentially the very first boss you could encounter. He's, however, not intended as the first, as he hits like a truck. Janetta will, however, join you for this fight, and her puns are terrible as always, but endearingly so. Otherwise, there's not much to say about the Owlbear. He's your standard early game aggressive FOE serving as a optional mini-boss fight. It's fine, there's no real complaints for me to be had here, but there's also not much for me to say on it other than, yeah, he looks pretty cool. Anyways, time to get on to the good stuff. Number 9, Dryad. The Dryad is a distant relative of the Alraune from the other Etrian Odyssey games, and your intended introduction to the post-game super bosses, which, for better or for worse, makes her one of the hardest fights in this game, only really coming behind the final boss, the zombie dragon, and maybe the hippogriff for me. Now, as a positive, Dryad is basically the Alraune fight from the other Etrian Odyssey games with a new design, and hey, I like that fight a lot, it's my favorite boss in Etrian Odyssey 1. But she has one major mechanic that feels downright oppressive to new players. She can go into this cocoon, heart, form, whatever thing, where she'll stop attacking you for a bit, but then she's going to heal herself for 22,000 HP. Granted, it has a telegraph, but when a boss is healing herself for over half her health, and that half of her health is higher than basically anything in the first 4 stratums before the postgame, it's just feels oppressive, and if you don't have a good way to bind her head, or at the very least paralyze her or put her to sleep and get lucky, you're kind of sunk here. Which, I guess on one hand is a good way of telling the player, hey, maybe you're not ready for this yet, but on the other hand, it just feels kind of mean. Though, when you know about the gimmick, it's not too bad, but it definitely feels oppressive for a first time playthrough, maybe a bit too much. If you're really struggling with this, just get Agar's QR code and add him into your party, because he's specially designed to slaughter this boss in like 2 hits. Number 8, the Primordiphant. Now, most Etrian Odyssey games have that one super boss that appears early in the game as a threat you can't realistically beat at the point you find it, which is usually the 2nd stratum, probably on the 8th floor. And the Primordiphant fills that role in Beyond the Myth and then some. Not only is it aggressive, but it'll actively chase you down if it sees you, making for a very difficult encounter in set piece for new players. Now, in battle, he's actually a bit weaker than the final boss is, being a massive physical brute, but being a bit weaker than the hardest boss in the game is not really a vote of confidence you'd hope for. Overall, while the boss is kind of straightforward, he brings that intimidation factor most early game super bosses have, and his design reminds me of the Oliphants from Lord of the Rings, and I love those movies. The Hobbit should have just ended at 2 movies though, but that's a rant for another day. Number 7, Amalgalum. The first boss of the game, and the ancient ancestor of the Golem and Cradle Guardians from Etrian Odyssey games of the past. Would you believe me if I said he has a similar fighting style to the true final boss of this game? The Amalgalum is, true to his name, being amalgamation of little golems found throughout the first stratum, and he always starts the fight by blasting himself apart with a heavy explosion, but after that the golems in the arena will infinitely respawn to join him in battle. And, build his limbs back together. But if you paid attention to the environment on the floor, you can actually cut off 4 of the 6 golems, significantly reducing the danger of this fight. And as a major positive for the 3D Etrian Odyssey games in general, a lot of the best fights have you doing something in the environment to actually get stuff done before the fight even begins. The little golems do their own thing, attacking you or supporting the main body, meanwhile trying to rejoin with the Amalgalum to give him different limbs, such as his heads, arms, or legs. and these will determine what skills he has access to. So this is also where binds come in handy, as we're only at the first boss fight and we're already seeing they can be useful. This is why I honest to goodness think the 3D Etrian games are in a lot of ways vastly superior to the 2D ones, with maybe the exception of Etrian 3, and the music here is excellent. The bosses have all these different little complexities and moving parts, and yeah, I should mention Etrian 5 was in development at the same time as Persona 5, and you can actually pretty much tell that Atlus had their creative juices flowing when designing their bosses at this time, because while it may not be as flashy due to the hardware limitations, I'd say this fight is just as involved as Shadow Kamoshida. Overall, this is a more than respectable introduction and a great first boss. Number 6, the Crystal Dragon. The RB Dragons, mateys. The Crystal Dragon is another excellent Stratum boss with some environmental interaction, and before the fight even begins, he's already firing on you, so you need to find a way to even get close to him before the fight can really start. But you know, those crystals sure do look familiar, and like the warp crystals we've seen throughout the dungeon. But even when you do get into the boss fight, it's still going to put up a challenge. Or it would, but before we get into this fight in particular, we had to address the Primordial in the room. At this point, you've now gained access to the skill Zombie Powder, a skill that insta-kills an enemy and creates a wraith with however much health the foe had remaining. And if they have over 10k HP, then the wraith will have 9,999 health. There's also a skill called Fair Trade, which sacrifices that wraith, and if it's maxed out, it deals their current HP total to the enemy as damage. There are FOEs in this dungeon with an exceptionally large weakness to instant death. What this all comes out to is meaning the boss is the easiest to cheese in the entire game, as he only has around 20,000 health, which is nowhere near enough to survive 3 Wraith nukes. And because of that, I do have to dock him some points, because yes, while you could say, oh, it's a cheap cheese strat, it's not a hard one to execute, and it's one that you might have actually gotten. But if we don't do that, the fight is still pretty good. He'll swap between his artillery and jet forms, with artillery form resisting all magic but being weak to all physical attacks, allowing him to use various elemental attacks at his disposal, and one of his signature moves, Prismatic Beam, which deals a ton of damage to whoever it hits. The artillery form does a lot of damage, but can also take a good bit of damage. Then, after he loses around 5,000 health, he'll swap to his jet form, resisting all physical. But now he'll gain a weakness to magic, but he'll also gain access to moves like Eternal Lament, which inflicts statuses and binds while removing your buffs, and having the highest priority of any enemy in the game, except maybe one single part of the startup hour. After reaching roughly half health, he'll spend the remainder of the fight swapping back and forth as he sees necessary in order to keep you adapting and on your toes. It's an awesome and dynamic boss fight, fitting for the endgame, but with the cheese strat is so easy to execute, I do have to dock him some serious points, and that does knock him out of great tier. Number 5, the Hippogriff. At the end of the second stratum, you meet the boss that I got stuck on for almost a week. The Hippogriff is probably the most straightforward boss in the game, as he doesn't have any crazy gimmicks or mystic powers. He just beats the crap out of you with his anchor arms. In a straight up fight though, you stand no chance against the Hippogriff, so you're going to have to find ways to get creative against him, but there's no arena puzzle to solve to weaken him, meaning it's time to get to work. While he's a physical powerhouse, he also has some telegraphs on what sorts of moves he's going to be using, such as when he brings his arms up, he's going to start countering attacking and trying to recover HP. But you can clearly tell by the animations he's using what actions will do what, and also his actions clearly show what limbs are being utilized for which attacks, meaning it's time for binds or status ailments, because things like blind work just as well here as it does against any regular enemy, and shows that status effects will be useful going forward, which I think is a good idea on the developer's part, because the Amalgam was immune to all status effects given that it was a sentient rock. For me, this boss is in the same vein as Kernunos from Etrian 1, being the tough early game challenge, more than willing to lay the smackdown on you. While he did wall me when I first played the game, That's also what made him stick in my mind much better than some of the other bosses, and why I actually like this fight quite a bit. Number 4, Devourer of Stars. Oh my god, they actually did it. They gave a super boss some story. Anyways, the true final battle of Etrian Odyssey 5 is pretty good in my opinion. He actually fights fair and plays by the rules. Granted, he can still be a tough battle, but he's actually a pretty enjoyable fight. And as I mentioned, his fight is essentially the Amalgam on crack, with him blowing off all his limbs to start the fight, and you have to find a way to survive this attack at the start. If you can't, then it's a non-starter in general, but hey, whatever. But once you figure out a way to get around it, either by Aegis Shield or putting him to sleep or managing to break a limb before he gets the attack off, he's going to continuously regrow at least one limb every turn, so now the fight becomes a thrilling juggling act of keeping him from getting back to full power, or at least delaying it until you can pop the Aegis Shield again, and you get that feeling of dread this foe brings, thanks to the excellent boss theme, Lord of the Beyond. Each limb serves a different purpose and gets its own action, making for one of the most aggressive fights in the game, but these limbs aren't quite treated as their own entities, and by that I mean you can find a way to shut down their brain, they won't be able to act, and this boss is susceptible to sleep, paralysis, and petrify, as well as all 3 binds. It can be a very tough fight, but it can also be very rewarding, to execute at least. However, it's also so late in the game that there's a high chance you'll have created an absolutely cracked team, in which case this thrilling battle goes out the window and you get a comedically easy battle where you can just bully him to death, to the point there are strategies to kill this boss with a team of level 20 characters, or even a team that can kill this boss on the first turn with counterattacks. But at the same time, I think that's just about a positive of how customizable modern Etrian Odyssey games are, even if they hadn't nailed the whole balancing thing yet in Etrian Odyssey 5. Number 3, Crow the Undead King. You know, Crow's design always made me think of a Necron, but that's not important. Anyways, being the 3rd Stratum boss, you may be surprised to hear he's honest to goodness the easiest of the major bosses, but that doesn't make him bad. Like Crystal Dragon, he's going to swap between 2 forms, flying and grounded, and these alter his movesets to an extent. With over 13,000 HP, he seems like he's an initially mighty foe, but he has the drawback of being weak to all damage types, so your values will be much bigger in this fight, but that also gives you a sense of empowerment. On top of that, you have Lily in your party for this fight, and she's a nice addition to the team for the narrative. The other cool thing about this boss is that his enemies aren't just there to soak up damage, but Crow takes on the role of a commander, giving out orders for them to execute and coordinate their attacks, which could make for a deadly foe. But with your recently acquired master skills and the 6th party member, it's a cool mechanic that doesn't quite turn into a big threat, but you know what, that's okay. Most of the other bosses are some crazy challenges, so having a slightly easier boss as a pick-me-up that's still mechanically rich and fun to fight is always nice in my book. And he's built up well throughout the first half of the game's story, on top of having a lasting impact on the world, because even after he dies, this place is still the fetid necropolis, and technically his plotline hasn't wrapped up until the post-game, because let's just say Crow wasn't exactly done necromancing enemies just yet. Number 2, the Eternal Tyrant. This is like the 4th video in the row, 5th if you count the short, where I put the final boss at number 2. Well, at least I'm getting less likely to get called biased now. Anyways, the Eternal Tyrant is one hell of a final boss fight, and in my personal opinion, he's also the hardest boss in the game, bar none. Yes, the post-game bosses have higher stats, but you can make some absolutely cracked builds in post-game and cheese the hell out of them, and most of their boss fights. You can't really do that against Eternal Tyrant. Even Wraith nuking won't work because he has enough health to survive all 3 nukes, and by the way the turn count goes in this game, he'll very likely get off the miasma by your 3rd Wraith nuke, and at that point the miasma is going to get out of control, killing the boss, and you all at the same time, and this game doesn't exactly have draws, it just ends in a loss for the player. It's the hardest fight in the game by a, in my opinion, more than comfortable margin, but everything he does still feels fair and like a test of mastery. And the music. Holy shit. Challenge the Stars is one of the best final boss themes in any Atlas game, comfortably in my top 3, and I stand by that statement. The only thing really holding this boss back from number 1 is his lack of story. He's not really built up throughout the game, he's just kind of this dangerous space monster you learn about on the second to last floor, and the game is like, yeah, this is your final boss, have fun. But Etrian Odyssey 5 isn't as narrative driven as a game like Persona 5, so an abrupt final boss isn't as big of a deal in my opinion. This fight has a ton of mechanics going on, but they all come together well. He's got all the different elements up his sleeve, multiple attacks involving each of his limbs, an absurdly powerful attack buff making everything he does hyper lethal, but it also buffs your party's attack as well. And honest to goodness, I was using items like the Laudanum in this fight, which 90% of the time is useless, but being able to clear out an enemy's buffs is really good, and it's an important strategy that he's not going to be able to just counter like, say, Harvester does. And he's not immune to status effects either, so there's tons of strategies to throw around here. The Miasma makes for a fun risk versus reward wrinkle because while it does hurt you, it also hurts the Eternal Tyrant, and the damage is spread across your party while he's taking a whole chunk of it. He's perfectly scaled for the end game, and yeah, it's, honest to goodness, it's a lot of fun. Etrian Odyssey 5 is by no means a new player-friendly game, and this game has kind of been made that way. It's more for those familiar with the series to push themselves and see how far they could adapt. And you know what? I think the final boss does an excellent job. In my opinion, it's a way better final boss than the snooze fest that was yelled about in Persona 5, and while I prefer final boss fights in Untold and Nexus over this one, this is still a more than fun and enjoyable finale, and as far as mechanics wise, he's unmatched. And number 1, the Dragon Zombie. Remember that ancient evil that Crow wanted to revive? Well, he did it in his final act, and the Dragon Zombie is, in my opinion, the most challenging, but also the most fun of Etrian Odyssey 5's category of super bosses. And in a lot of ways acts as kind of the true wrap-up to the narrative, being the strongest creature in the labyrinth, capping off Lily and Solor's storyline, which was by far the most involved plotline in this game, and even further, he's been built up well, and he's probably the most built up of the super bosses with the addition of some voice-acted cutscenes. And before the battle even begins, the zombie dragon will spot you and begin breathing miasma throughout the floor, and you need to navigate over to him in this darkness. Now, on its own, the miasma actually doesn't really harm you in any major way, but it does severely limit visibility, and it's highly flammable, so if you use a fire attack in a battle, you're gonna get launched sky high. Getting into the boss fight proper, I've been putting it off long enough. End of Raging Waves is the best boss theme in the series, and there's a reason it's been featured in over half the games, well, in the series. And Etrian Odyssey 5's rendition is no slouch either. Now, as for the fight proper, mechanics-wise, Zombie Dragon has some elemental attacks up his sleeve, sure, but the real focus is on status effects between the blinding miasma and the different ailment rains. This initially sounds super annoying, but then you remember you can only have one ailment afflicted at a time in Etrian Odyssey. Then it almost becomes a puzzle, and it's a way to make him an in-game challenge without just overloading his damage. Even more interestingly, though, he's not immune to his own status effects. Casting them will make him afflicted just as easily as you are, which is kinda hilarious, not gonna lie. But when he's afflicted, he gets another bonus of his own, either to his defenses or just straight up regenerating some health, though it's thankfully only around 500 to 600 health and not 22,000. And despite being a corpse, he still has the ability to breathe fire occasionally, and in this case, hope your resistance is good because the air is about to ignite, blowing everyone up, the zombie dragon included. Hilariously, you actually get his rare item drop by having him kill himself with his own fire breath exploding on him, blowing his own body apart, which is both awesome and kinda gruesome. This might just be my favorite super boss Atlas has made. It's got a solid connection to the story, a very cool design, some fantastic music, and it doesn't require you to have encyclopedic knowledge in order to win. Instead, it tests you to see how well are you able to adapt and think on your feet, as the battle is constantly changing. Any team you bring along is viable for this fight, but you have to know what you're doing with them. And I vastly prefer that style of boss fight over the terms and service lists they so often plague the Atlas games. 10 out of 10 boss fight, I love it. And that's all for this video. Etrian Odyssey 5 isn't my favorite game in the series, but it is one I enjoy quite a bit, and was objectively a major step up in quality over the previous entries with an overhauled UI, stat systems, and dungeon events. I'm not sure if I'd say this is an entry you should necessarily start with in terms of difficulty, but narratively it's one you can jump right into. And if you've beaten most Atlas games on their hardest mode, you should be able to jump into this and have a fun time. That's all I've got for now. If you want to see more videos of varying quality or more videos like this, consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you all next time. I've uploaded 5 boss rankings in 5 days. My body is a machine that turns stupid frickin' ideas into 15 to 45 minute videos. I am going to rest.
Good atmosphere.